Horace, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here today and delighted to share this platform with Bill Taylor. What I thought I might talk about is really three things. What it looks like the Moscow summit did, what the Moscow summit didn't do, and what this means for Ukraine. And I'll argue that I think that this outcome is actually a fairly good one for Ukraine. First of all, if you look at the summit, the discussions yesterday, and then what we're beginning to hear about today, I'd say there were really four areas. First, and this is not a surprise, both Washington and Moscow made clear that they attached most priority to the question of finding a replacement for the Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty, which expires in December of this year. So you had agreement by the two presidents to some basic guidelines that will form instructions for the negotiators in terms of limitations for the new treaty, which represent about a third reduction compared to the 2002 treaty signed by Presidents Bush and Putin. I think that's a good thing. Missile defense, which is often linked to arms control, did come up. There doesn't seem to be a clear resolution on the missile defense question, but there was a joint statement talking about efforts to find cooperation in this area. And I thought it was interesting that today in his speech, President Obama reiterated a point that the administration has made previously, which is that it is very concerned about the prospect of an Iranian long-range ballistic missile. But if that missile threat goes away, the rationale for deploying a missile defense system in Central Europe also goes away. The second area that came out of the summit was the agreement on a structure to manage broader U.S.-Russia relations. And it looks like they've taken something that looked like the Gore-Chernomyrdin structure, but in fact this time it'll be headed by the two presidents. And in fact it actually has a wider number of committees than was the case 10 years ago under Vice President Gore and Prime Minister Chernomyrdin. Third, there were some additional agreements, Afghanistan cooperation, and a particularly important point for the U.S. military was Russian agreement to allow the U.S. military to overfly Russia with lethal military equipment, which will make the job of resupplying American and NATO forces in Afghanistan easier. Also agreement on intensifying efforts to control nuclear proliferation by consolidating nuclear materials in third countries, and a reestablishment of a military-to-military contacts program. And then the fourth part is really what took place today, and that would be outreach by President Obama to civil society, to the business community, and also to the Russian public in his speech at the Moscow New Economics School. Now, last comment on what came out of this. U.S.-Russian relations are not going to change overnight. By the end of 2008, they were at their lowest point in 20 years. But it does seem like Moscow represents a good foundation on which to build if the sides can sustain the momentum to try to move the relationship to a more positive place. My second point, what Moscow did not do, and I put this in the context of I spent 3 days in Moscow last week, one day of which was at a conference with a large number of representatives of Russian think tanks. And the focus of our Russian colleagues in that discussion was on what they described as the big deal. And the big deal, as they put it, would be Russian cooperation with the United States on North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq in return for American acknowledgement, recognition of Russian primacy in the post-Soviet space. And that would mean things like backing off on NATO enlargement, support for European Union enlargement. And this was seen by the think tank community as essential to advancing U.S.-Russia relations. Interestingly, we did not hear that from Russian officials with whom we spoke last week. And again, looking at the results of the last 2 days of discussions, I think it's pretty clear that this big deal, if it came up, it certainly was not accepted by President Obama, who yesterday in his press conference after his meeting with President Medvedev went out of his way to make clear that there were areas on which the United States and Russia continued to disagree, one of which was Georgia. And today in his speech, he talked about also the question of international security systems and reiterated that countries such as Ukraine and Georgia should have the right to determine their own security systems. So it seems to me that the president did strike the balance in reset that was foreshadowed by comments by Vice President Biden in Munich in February, by Secretary Clinton in Brussels in March, and then by the president himself, which was that while the United States wants to reset relations with Russia, it's not prepared to do so at the expense of third countries. It's not prepared to accept a Russian sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and it will continue to support the right of countries such as Ukraine and Georgia as sovereign states to determine their own foreign policy course. Now, my third point and last point would be why I think that this outcome is a good thing for Ukraine. First of all, in Moscow, the president reiterated that the United States would be supporting the rights of countries such as Ukraine and Georgia to pursue their own foreign policy course. But I would go beyond that and argue that if you look over the last 18 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there have been more positive relations between the United States and Russia, that's actually been a good thing for Ukraine. Kyiv has had more freedom for maneuver in terms of pursuing a pro-European policy when there are warmer relations between Washington and Moscow. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. In 1997, which was a fairly positive time in U.S.-Russia relations, it was the time when the NATO-Russia Council was created. That was also the time that the NATO, you had the consolidation of the strategic partnership between Washington and Kyiv. You had the first meeting of the Gore-Kuchma Commission, and you had the establishment of a distinctive partnership between NATO and Ukraine. In 2002, which was probably the high point of U.S.-Russian relations during the Bush administration, you had an announcement by the Ukrainian government that its ultimate goal was to join NATO. And there was virtually no negative reaction from Russia. Now, contrast that with the situation last year. 2008 was by far the most difficult year in U.S.-Russian relations since the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was also the time that you saw maximum pressure by Russia on Kyiv over questions such as NATO enlargement. So I think from the perspective of Ukraine and its geopolitical choice, it has more options, it has more flexibility when the relationship between the United States and Russia is moving in a more positive direction. And therefore, I think yesterday's results were good not only for U.S.-Russia, but also can be helpful for Ukraine.